Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Rey Lopez after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5 begins the Rey Lopez, and more specifically, today we're going to be talking about the Berlin variation beginning with the move knight to f6, and basically how to face this with the white pieces. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, click on that notification icon. So the Berlin and the Marshall variation have been giving the Rey Lopez a lot of headaches for a lot of years now. Basically, it's very difficult for white to get any kind of advantage against either one of these openings. Now, of the two, I think the one that actually causes white more problems is the Marshall defense. We don't even allow the Marshall defense anymore. It's causing us so many problems. We basically just play anti-Marshalls. The Marshall defense itself has been analyzed almost to a forced perpetual, and so it's not even worth trying to play against the Marshall anymore. We basically just play against the anti-Marshall, and we just analyze those systems when somebody threatens to play the Marshall. Now the Berlin's a little different. Most of the lines within the Berlin, white still gets some sort of slow grind, even if you play the main lines. But that slow grind has always proven very difficult to get anything out of, so it's just kind of like squeeze water out of a rock, and there's just not enough water in that rock to get any kind of advantage. So there's also a lot of anti-Berlins that are starting to get played, and people are trying different stuff. So anyways, this video we're going to be looking at just the main line and like kind of how we can try to play for an advantage within the main line, things that have been tried in the past, and things that maybe people should try in the future to try to get more advantages with that slow grind. So the main line is just castles kingside. And then we have knight takes e4, and then the main line is just pawn to d4 here. And then black retreats with knight to d6. Now, a cute little note here is one of the really popular lines going around today on the Grandmaster level is if white has absolutely no ambition to win the game at all, white is actually continuing here with the move d takes e5, which essentially forces a draw. After d takes e5, knight takes b5, a4, and the point is the knight is actually trapped on the b5 square. It doesn't have a square to move to where it can't get captured, so the knight goes to d4. We exchange knights, the queen takes, and white gets his piece back. Then black equalizes in the center with pawn to d5. And then, according to the engine, this is all engine perfect play, and we need to take this pawn with en passant. The queen recaptures, and then we simply repeat moves. We go queen e4 check, queen e6, queen d4, queen back to d6, offering the exchange, queen e4, queen e6, and we move back and forth, and everybody just, it's a draw by perpetual. So this is kind of something that's gotten popular lately for people that just don't want to even try to play against the Berlin with white, and they happen to be okay with getting a draw with the white pieces at the highest levels. So you could argue that both the Berlin and the Marshall both end in a perpetual if played correctly, but I would argue that this move d takes e5 is, of course, totally unnecessary. There's nothing wrong with the old main line here, which is just this move bishop takes c6, d captures c6, and then d captures c5, knight to f5, queen d8, king d8. So here we begin kind of the old main line, and as you can see, I've kind of highlighted white's idea here. White's idea is essentially to activate his kingside pawn majority, because here we have a very similar position to what you would get out of like an exchange variation Rey Lopez. Now, in theory, this position should be a little bit better than the exchange variation, and that's why for years nobody really thought the Berlin was much of anything to look at. You've lost your right to castle, your king is stuck in the middle, you have the two bishops for the kingside majority, but boy, it's difficult to organize your pieces, and it doesn't seem like black should be able to equalize very easily in a position like this. When white is castled, he already has part of his kingside majority advanced all the way to the e5 square. He has more space, and just looks like he just has a better position in general. But the person that reintroduced this into tournament practice at the very highest levels was Vladimir Kramnik, who sprung it against Garry Kasparov as kind of this surprise weapon against Garry Kasparov's Rey Lopez in the World Championship match in 2001. And he played it against him over and over and over again, and drew with black over and over and over again. At no point was Kasparov able to break through and get his kingside majority activated in a way that was totally satisfactory, and he was never quite able to win a single game. And that's the difficulty here, is how do we organize our pieces to activate this kingside majority? So this is really, really important. So Kasparov played the old move here. He played knight c3, which was just thought to be the main line. This is one of the games from that World Championship match back in 2001, Garry Kasparov versus Vladimir Kramnik. So knight c3 was a move that got played, and then Kramnik played king e8. He could have left the king there. That's also another line. And now Kasparov played h3 with goals of eventually activating his kingside majority with g4, etc. So one question you might be asking is, I pointed out that White's idea is to eventually activate his kingside majority, and if he manages to get in, say, the moves h3, g4, pawn to f4, pawn f5, if he gets all of that in, and nothing else has happened in the position, like nothing else has gone wrong, basically White should have some kind of winning advantage if his kingside majority gets completely activated. The difficulty is we can't do that very easily at any given point without our position falling apart. So, like right now, Black doesn't look very active at all. It looks like all of his pieces are on their original squares. But keep in mind, these pieces develop very naturally and very smoothly, like bishop c5, bishop e6, etc. It's not so easy to just play g4. So, for example, if we play g4 here, for instance, and then just, say, a retreating move, knight e7, we have to spend a move to defend our pawn, h3, and then Black can play h5, no cost to him. We're going to have to play a move like knight h2, and now it looks like, hey, our plan is to play f4, f5, we should be good to go. But it's actually Black that has an advantage here. After knight d5, we can't capture that knight without Black having a major advantage. Like knight takes d5, c takes d5, now Black doesn't have double pawns anymore. He has a queenside majority to counter our kingside majority, and he has the bishop pair and we don't. So we would have to avoid that exchange. We could play something like knight to e4, but then here's the issue. After h takes g4, h takes g4, Black could simply play knight to b4, hitting that pawn on c2. And that pawn on c2 doesn't have a great defense. So if, for instance, we try to defend it, we play something like c3, they can just plop that knight down into d3 instead. And now if we play something like f4, activating our kingside majority, our position is actually pretty bad, at least in the short term. Now, if somehow Black does nothing, long term our position is pretty spectacular. Like if we could have played f4, f5 in one move, we would have been doing, a-okay. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough time to do that all in one move. And what you end up with is a lot of loose pieces. The knight on e4 is loose. It's not anchored. Nothing's defending it. The knight on h2 is loose. And again, this rook is attacking it, and only the king is defending it. So these two knights are not anchored. They can easily be attacked. We have a lot of holes in the position. The king and the rook are kind of wide open to checks from c5, to threats from the long diagonal on d5. And Black is just in time to take advantage of all of this. So for example, he could play bishop to e6, rook to d1, trying to kick the knight out of there, but just not quite in time. Bishop to d5, we can counter rook d3 with bishop takes e4. So now, if knight back to g3, defending everything, bishop to c5 check would just be winning on the spot. The knight on h2 is hanging, both of the bishops are cutting up the long diagonals, and it's basically just game over. So that's the issue. We try to activate this kingside majority, but if we activate it too early and we don't activate it in the right way, we end up letting all of Black's pieces into our position. So Kasparov is well aware of this. Kasparov is, or was one of the greatest players that ever lived. And, he understood that he needed to act kind of slowly. So he plays h3, Kramnik plays bishop e7, and then Kasparov plays really the correct positional reply here. He plays bishop to g5, basically just trying to get rid of the bishop pair, which normally is a really smart thing to do. You have a kingside majority, your opponent doesn't. If you get rid of the bishop pair, like after bishop takes g5, knight g5, it should just be your kingside majority versus his non-kingside majority, and clearly that position should be better for White. Well, Kramnik took. He played bishop takes g5. He said, I don't care about the bishop pair. He said, I don't think you can ever activate your kingside majority smoothly, and if you don't activate your kingside majority, bishop pair or not, the position is just equal. There's nothing here to write home about. So Kasparov took, knight takes g5. We have h6 kicking the knight away, knight back to e4, b6 preventing the knight from coming into the c5 square, rook f to d1, and then we have knight back to e7, Kramnik just preparing to redeploy this knight. We have pawn to f4, we have knight to g6, we have rook back to f1, and then we have pawn to h5. So what's happening here is Kasparov is trying to activate that majority. He's trying to play f4, f5, etc., and get his majority activated, trying to play g4 or whatever. So here, after pawn to h5, which, as you can see, Kramnik timed this h5 move perfectly. He knew that g4 was coming. If he waited one more move, g4 was going to come. Obviously, there's no dark squared bishop, no problems on the dark square. We have nice squares to tuck our pieces into. If g4 had come, then it probably was just advantage white. So this is all very well timed to defense. So after h5, Kasparov plays rook a e1, and then we have bishop f5, and then we have knight g3, which is an incredibly clever move from Garry Kasparov. Because black can play bishop takes c2 if he wants to in this position. There's no doubt about that. But if black were to play bishop takes c2, Kasparov would finally get to activate his kingside pawn majority, and this should actually prove decisive. For example, if bishop takes c2, we would have pawn to f5, knight back to f8, rook f2 hitting that bishop again. That bishop would have to go to d3, and then we would have rook d2. That bishop would have to run all the way back to a6, basically just out of the way, and then we would play something like rook e6, and white has a huge position in the middle of the board with all of his pieces. This would be kind of a classic kind of Kasparov game if this is what happened. This is how Kasparov kind of beat everybody, and this was why people didn't play stuff like the Berlin against Garry Kasparov, because Garry Kasparov was a scary guy when it came to, sacrificing a pawn to activate his position. And this would have been, huge advantage white. For instance, would be something like, let's say pawn to h4, knight back to e2, bishop takes e2, pawn takes f7, king takes f7, and then rook d2, kind of just threatening to come to e7 and c7, and this is a nightmarishly bad position for black. But Kramnik wasn't having any of it. He saw knight g3, and he was just like, okay, whatever, I'll just defend it, I don't care. So he again just kind of shows disrespect to his bishop. He's like, look, all that matters is when you play knight f5, which Kasparov did, because he kind of has to, and I play knight takes f5, how are you going to ever activate your kingside majority smoothly? So knight takes f5, we have king f2, knight to d4, again hitting that c2 square, and again it's kind of a scary situation. So Kasparov plays rook to c1. Kasparov thought after the game maybe he could have tried something like rook to d1. Again, not caring so much if this pawn gets captured, just because maybe he can get something going on the king side at that point. Like, for example, rook d2, knight b4, and then rook f to d1. He takes the open file, and he's threatening at some point to play f5 and e6, but this position is still just kind of unclear. So after knight d4, he played rook to c1, and then we have rook to d8, rook f d1, king e7, knight e4, pawn to h4, which makes it nearly impossible to ever play g4, and it's just a very well-timed move. We have b4, and then rook h5 was actually a question mark move. The correct move was just something like knight f5, and again, very difficult for white to make any progress here. But rook h5, and Kasparov missed his opportunity. He's been looking for it all game, and he missed his opportunity to finally play g4. He could have got away with g4. It's a rather simple combination. After, say, h takes g3, question mark, knight takes g3, rook takes h3, he would have had rook d4, and then knight f5 check, forks the king and rook, and it would have been completely winning. So this was one of the few instances where he could have actually played g4, activated his kingside majority, and gotten away with it. Unfortunately, he missed this tactical shot. Both players missed the tactical shot. So the game instead continued knight to g5, rook h to h8, and now it's off the table. Rook d3, knight back to e6, takes. The rook's doubled, the rook goes to d5, c4, takes, a5, and basically this rook and pawn endgame is dead. White never activated his kingside majority, and Kramnik's technique in rook and pawn endgames was pretty much impeccable. So if it's not enough to win, Kramnik's basically just going to prove it, and it's going to end in a draw, and that's what happened. He plays f5, it's just going to be a 3-on-3, he's going to take on e7, and it's just completely equal, and there's absolutely no reason to keep playing. So that was the difficulty. So the question is, what kind of improvements have we made in playing against the Berlin since Garry Kasparov kind of had this extreme difficulty playing against the Berlin in his game against Vladimir Kramnik? Well, let's go back to the initial position of the Berlin with the knight on f6, and we'll take a look at Castle's kingside. Knight takes e4, d4, knight back to d6, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, d takes e5, knight f5, takes. So this is where kind of the main line position starts. This is where we have our ideas to play g4, f4, f5. So the answer to what kind of improvements have we made are really not that many. We've, since 2001, we've come up with a lot of different ways that we can try to eventually activate our kingside majority. But there is no clear path to activate our kingside majority, no matter what move order we choose. Now, there are multiple move orders that we can try. Like, we can try, instead of knight c3, which Garry Kasparov played in the game, Garry Kasparov played knight c3 and followed up with h3, we can start with h3. For instance, we can play h3, knight e7, and then we can play rook d1 check. And this is actually following a game where Bashir Lagrave managed to break through against David Howell in Berlin back in 2018. And that game continued king e8, and you can see that it's a little different. We play knight c3, and we're in a similar position to the Kasparov game, but it's not identical. We have knight to g6, knight d4, bishop d7, f4 just to try to activate that majority straight away, rook d8, bishop e3, h5, keeping g4 under wraps, preventing us from playing g4, f5, etc. And then, again, we just prepare for the slow grind. We play rook d2, make these minor improvements, a6, bring our knight to e4, knight h4, bishop back to f2, hitting that knight g6, bishop to g3, and basically just trying to maneuver and make these improvements so eventually we can play pawn to f5 and break through. So we have h4, bishop h2, c5, knight back to f3, knight f8, king f2, rook h5, knight to c3, bishop f5, knight to d5, knight e6, and you can just see a lot of maneuvering. So it's like, usually after these games where people successfully break through, they go back and they find improvements. How could I have kept his kingside under wraps? And there's usually a way to do it. In this case, eventually, got lucky, and he managed to kind of combinatively get an advantage. He got his rook to d5. He's winning that pawn on the c5 square. And he's still got his slight majority on the king side, even though he was never able to fully activate that majority. And this very, very, very slight pull in this endgame allowed him to win the game from here, but the game just went on forever. It was a 76-move game. So he did eventually win, but it wasn't exactly like this massive opening success. It was more like, again, trying to squeeze water out of that rock. He managed to get to a position where he was up a pawn and had a slight edge, but it was by no means just this clear advantage with the white pieces. And that seems like it's every win in the Berlin variation. Another thing that people can try is after king d8, a move that I think is really underutilized is this move pawn to b3. It seems like everybody still tries knight to c3 thinking this must be the best move, and certainly it's like the computer's top pick. But after our top picks fail, we can certainly try other things. Every position is going to be a slow grind. Now, the idea behind b3 isn't even to necessarily fianchetto the bishop to b2, and I think that's why a lot of people are kind of turned off by the move pawn to b3, because they're thinking, well, I don't really want to put my bishop on the b2 square. There's cases where I want to put my bishop on g5. I certainly want the option to go to bishop g5 or bishop f4 or develop my bishop this way. Really, the idea behind pawn to b3 is to be able to play something like b3 and c4 so that we can keep the knight and the bishop out of the d5 square. If we can keep the knight and the bishop out of the d5 square, then activating our kingside majority becomes more of a threat, because they don't have this rejoinder of playing bishop to e6 to d5, and then if we finally do get our pawns on f4 and g4, they just play bishop c5 check and we resign. So if you play b3 and c4 kind of early, it's actually sort of difficult for black to defend against the eventual advance of the kingside pawns. But again, it's a grind. It takes time to play b3 and c4. This gives black time to set up some sort of defense to you trying to activate your kingside majority. So one person that did try this, and I kind of liked watching his games, was Wesley So. So Wesley So had a game that continued knight to e7. This was So versus Zhao, played in Las Vegas, Nevada back in 2014. It continued knight e7, and this was his idea, c4, just keep the knight out of d5. Right? His idea wasn't even to fianchetto, and he proves that with his next move. After knight g6, h3, bishop d7, he plays knight c3. He still hasn't fianchettoed his bishop. King to e8, knight goes back to e2, and then we have rook to d8, rook to d1, bishop to e7, and now bishop to e3. So he develops his bishop this way. He didn't really intend to develop his bishop to the long diagonal. Actually, it was still possible. He could have played bishop b2, and it was almost as good as bishop e3, but then his opponent just plays h5 and prevents the advance of his kingside pawn majority, and then, you kind of want to play bishop g5 here, but you can't because your bishop is already on b2. So that's why bishop e3, and then we have a6, we have king h2, and just basically playing to activate this majority slowly. He's going to try to grind out the majority. So g3, king g2, rook d1, rook d1, rook g8, bishop back to c1, b6, bishop back to e3, bishop to b7, c5, keeping that bishop from becoming active, dc5, then he plays knight c3, goes after that weakness on the c5 square, takes on the c5 square, exchanges off the bishop pair, so now it's two knights versus a bishop and a knight, and he's still struggling to activate his kingside majority, but black's pawns are a little bit weaker than in any of the Kasparov games, so white's got a little bit more out of this than he would have normally. So knight back to c3, rook back to d8, knight takes on d5, rook takes d5, rook back to e1, and eventually he was actually able to activate his majority. He's able to play knight g5, the exchange happens, and now he's got a 3-on-2. And now it's a lot easier to activate the 3-on-2 and eventually the 3-on-1 than it was to activate the 4-on-3. So once he gets all of this in, he starts pushing his kingside pawns forward. And now he's got a potential passed pawn on the h6 square, and this is exactly what you want. You activate this majority, and then you make it very difficult for black to defend against the eventual push of your passed pawns. So we have g6 here, just basically preparing at some point to, play possibly even h6, g7, g8, and also preparing to target the g7 square. So rook f7, king d8, h6 takes, g7, and the game is basically over. Black has to sacrifice a whole knight, and here we go. So this was an example of white actually eventually managing to activate his kingside majority, beginning with the move pawn to b3 and then pawn to c4, and just taking on this super slow plan, which I think is okay, because every plan is at this point super slow. Even the plans beginning with knight c3 and all of the stuff that Kasparov tried and all the people that have tried knight c3 after, even though the computer says knight c3 is the best move, everything after that, if black finds perfect play, which black is finding perfect play, everything after that is a slow grind to activate your kingside majority, which is what you have to do if you're going to win against the Berlin and you're going to play the main line. So anyways, that's how you play against the mainline Berlin. Of course, I didn't have time to go over any of the anti-Berlin stuff. This is already a 22-minute video, and I'm just going over the main line of the Berlin. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.